The European Union postpones long-planned trade talks with Australia amid an escalating row over Canberra's decision to cancel a $40 billion deal with France. An EU official said trade talks have been delayed for a month until November. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had previously raised doubts that the bloc could strike a trade deal with Australia. Last month, Canberra canceled a deal with France's naval group to build a fleet of conventional submarines. It instead signed a trilateral pact with the U.S. and Britain to build a number of nuclear-powered subs. Cancellation enraged France, which accused both Australia and the U.S. of stabbing it in the back and recalled its ambassadors to Canberra and Washington. Joining us now from Ontario, Canada for more on the story is Jason Unruhe, political commentator. Hello, Jason. Hope you're safe and doing well out there. Your thoughts on this continued fallout from the AUKUS pact between the UK, Canberra, and the U.S. to build these nuclear-powered submarines that has really irked a lot of people?
Well, this is certainly a very terrible diplomatic mess, and one that they've basically acquiesced themselves into. I mean, this is essentially their own fault. By that I mean the U.S., etc. Obviously, France wasn't very happy about this. But I think it is very typical of much of the way that the military-industrial complex around the world does work. I mean, there's a lot of backdoor deals that go on that we're not privy to. I think this is one of the few times where it happened to be something that was big enough to blow up into something that the public can see. I mean, we're talking about what are essentially NATO countries talking about supplying each other with arms, and of course all these arms manufacturers, regardless of what country they're in, are competing with each other for those contracts and the profits that come out of it. So I think it's simply a deal where one company managed to snake it out from another one by canceling an existing deal because they got a better one, which isn't good business, but that's really besides the point. What matters is the money here. But I think this shows a divide in many of the imperialist countries around the world, particularly the ones either directly in or one big total bloc against, quote, the enemies of freedom, etc., when they too are rife with internal contradictions, so one of those being competition just for that sake, and that they are certainly not the monolithic force that they claim to be, if they're certainly in this situation willing to undermine one another in order to sort of build this defense against, frankly, what is essentially the combination of China and Russia, those Eurasian powers that are opposing the West. So I think that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's a great point you're making. So the big question here is it going to be worthwhile for the U.S., this deal, this AUKUS deal, to turn away your NATO partners, your European allies, because we heard them speaking more about their own autonomy away from you? Is it worth this one submarine deal, what the U.S. is doing with the Europeans?
Well, I think to the guy who's going to make the billions of dollars off of this, or the hundreds of millions, or whatever it's going to be, it certainly is worth it. I think the question is, diplomatically, is it worth it? And I think that this is a question that only France itself can answer, because it's a question of whether or not they're going to retaliate. If France doesn't retaliate and just lets things continue as normal, then, well, I guess it certainly was worth it, because there were no ill effects from it. But as we've seen, this is already a diplomatic problem right now. I mean, France may be, the political establishment may be behind the doors trying to look at ways to get back at the U.S. for this, or to punish those who break the deal. Maybe they could take them to court if the contracts would certainly bear some scrutiny like that, depending on what it is that France to do. I think that it definitely in this situation, what needs to happen is France needs to respond with something significant that shows that they won't just lie down and get, frankly, it is a backstab in this case. But it's interesting to watch the diplomatic row between countries that are supposed to be a monolithic force against the enemies of so-called freedom. But it's really whether or not it's worth all of this is going to be up to France and how they do or do not retaliate against this.
And before you let it go, Jason, the Chinese are laughing this thing off, saying you guys think you're going to give Canberra, even a dozen nuclear powered submarines, if you think that's going to keep us in check in the region, you have another thing coming.
Oh no, certainly not. I mean, China has a very large navy, of which 12 counteracting submarines is not going to be that too much of a threat. I think this is more like a demonstration of willingness on the part of particularly Australia to be saber rattling, as it were, against China, to show, yeah, we are going to build up against you. We are going to demonstrate that we will be hostile if necessary. We will use that force, even though you're our largest trading partner, which makes no sense, but that's the world we live in today. But no, it's going to take more than 12 nuclear submarines to actually threaten a behemoth like China.
Thanks, Jason. I don't even think it was 12. I think it's 8. I think the initial contract with France was 12 for electric diesel. I believe this one is 8. I could be wrong. But thanks. It's always a pleasure checking with you, Mr. Stay safe, bud. Jason Unruhe,
right.
joining us from Ontario, political commentator.
Thank you.
You bet.